problem. So I'd like to welcome our viewers and guests to this EAC Zoom interview. It's a series on how the states are responding and preparing for COVID-19 and election season. The title of this Zoom interview is Emergency Election Laws and COVID-19. I'd like to welcome our guests, Mark Goins, Walt, Latham, and Michael Morley to our virtual interview. And thank you all for taking your time to talk about this important issue. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce them with the highlights of their biographies. Let's start with Mark Goins. He's an attorney who has been the coordinator of elections in Tennessee since 2009. Prior to that, he served on the Tennessee State Election Commission from 2005 to 2008. So it's not common that we have a former state legislator in the election community, but we have one today. Mark Goins served as the representative of District 34 in the Tennessee House of Representatives. And during his tenure, he served on the election subcommittee, of course. Even more importantly, Mark has served as for years on the EAC Standards Board, including the chair, and he serves on the current executive board. Our next guest is Walt Latham. He's also an attorney and a friend. He's admitted to practice law in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He has a master's in public policy from William and Mary. He has also served as York County's general registrar since 2007. He's been a leader in the Virginia election community for years, serving as the president of Voter Registrars Association in Virginia from 2017 to 2019. Our next guest is Professor Michael Morley. He's also an attorney. He is an assistant professor of law at Florida State University College of Law, where he teaches and writes in the areas of election law, federal courts, and constitutional laws. His work has been cited by the Supreme Court and published in many of the nation's leading law reviews. Prior to academia, he was an associate at Williams and Connolly and Winston and Strawn. In public service, he served as special assistant to the General Counsel of the Army, and he clerked for Judge Gerald Choflat of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. He's a graduate of the Yale Law School and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. So we have a number of qualified folks, and this is an important issue. I'd like to start off the questions with basically talking with the election officials first. But based on your experience dealing with the emergencies that you've dealt with, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, other disasters, what are some of the considerations that election officials should be aware of while planning for our upcoming elections this year in a COVID-19 environment? Go ahead and start with you, Mark.
Yeah, so we've had a few things that we've had to deal with in Tennessee. In 2010, we had a local election, actually Nashville, Davidson County, countywide, which is the second largest county in Tennessee at the time, was at the time. We actually had to move the election because of a flood. And although that sounds like maybe a great thing to do, that creates challenges as well. Once you have all the locations, it's already scheduled to be in place. You got your poll officials ready to go. That moving that election is an extreme challenge. So if there's anyone that has to do that during COVID-19, I feel for you because we've had to do so. Sometimes you can't get, particularly in 2010, we couldn't get all the same locations we'd scheduled. We certainly had a drop in poll officials, but we had to do it because of the flood right before then. Most recently, and Tennessee, unfortunately, is getting a lot of experience with this. 2018, we had a tornado, we had some counties, and we literally had one small county operating on generators all day long. But most recently, this March presidential preference primary, we had a tornado that literally went over 50 miles, one of the longest stretching tornadoes in the history of certainly Tennessee, and I think even the United States. And in doing so, we had to plan. I'll tell you the thing that as election officials, one of the keys to not only COVID-19, but even disaster planning for tornadoes, one of the things we did, we had conducted a tabletop exercise where folks had to plan for an election, and really is based more on cybersecurity, but we did throw something in extra when we were doing our tabletop, and that was a tornado. And that was before the tornado hit in November of 2018. Fast forward to 2020, the distinction is this, and this is the thing that planning really comes through and helps. When you're planning for a tornado, you're not really saying it's going to hit you or it's going to hit your area. But my day started out at 12:45. I literally was in my 12:45 a.m. I was in my safe place because literally the sirens were going off. The tornado was hitting all around us. It did not hit my house. But if, I left my house knowing that my neighbors, my church, my kids' school had all been affected by the tornado. And then throughout the morning, word started to get out that individuals that I personally knew had passed away. Although those things affect you and you do lose focus somewhat, the main thing is if you plan for it, then you do have a sense of calmness, even though those personal things are affecting you. And so I guess the biggest thing is that I can share with anyone is, plan, because we are all hoping and praying that COVID-19 goes away. But what if it doesn't? And the fact is it may not. And so you really need to have a contingency and a contingency to the contingency. One of the things that did happen on that day, and this is a best practice or tidbit I like to throw out there, the tornado hit at 12:45, mostly in Davis, like Davidson County, we hit other counties as well. At 2 a.m., we already had press releases out. So we were telling folks we created a super site and a mega site, and their law allowed for us to do that. We've actually expanded the law a little bit since then to take into consideration some things we saw on election day. But frankly, a mega site was where any voter could come, and that was the Election Commission office. So at 2 a.m., we sent something out. We didn't even know all the polling locations that had been affected at that point. 2 a.m., we're getting a press release out. One of the things that I would encourage people to do is pre-write your press releases. You don't know what areas are going to be hit, what the disaster may be, but certainly you do know certain things. We know right now that COVID-19, we could have a polling location that closes because it has to be quarantined because of some type of exposure. So pre-write your press releases and don't be the only person that has that press release. Have it multiple ways. Take a screenshot, have it on your phone. If you're, obviously I'm coming from the state level, but what we did, the county level where they had service, they were able to get the press release out on their end. On our end, we were tweeting it. We were trying to get it as much as possible as well, because don't assume you're going to have the proper communication channels. But anything that you've got in advance, please do so. The other thing that helped that day, and I learned this from someone who had been in EMA for Emergency Management Agency for a number of years. We're so used to electronic address books and contacts, and we also, on election day, we have an exhaustive list of folks we're going to contact. One of the things he told me, and I used it religiously that day, even though all these contacts are stored other places, he said, get a note card, 3x5, find 10 people that that you're going to have to come in contact with for certain different emergencies. And just the time that saved, looking at the card and making the phone calls, you don't have to worry about if you lose service, if you leave your phone somewhere. So that's two tidbits that I really used that day, was the emergency contact list and also being able to get the word out. The other thing with communication is we did have a communication struggle. You need to build those relationships with your local EMA, because that's how we found out a lot of different polling locations weren't open, where electricity was out, those things. If police officers were there, they were communicating to a lot of different individuals. So it's all about planning. And that's the biggest thing I would say that you can learn from planning for a tornado. Same thing for COVID-19. The only distinction is a tornado happens all of a sudden. COVID-19 happened also back in, almost overnight, at least that's what it feels like. But now it's not. Now it's long term. And so we do have at least an idea of what's going on.
Thank you, Mark. Walt?
Well, I think that since 2001, there's been a lot of focus about being prepared for terrorism and disasters like that. And there hasn't been as much focus on being prepared for weather issues or acts of God, natural events like infections. And those are the ones that seem to be presenting some of the larger issues. And they're harder to work with because if a hurricane wipes out, significant parts of New Jersey and New York, and you have a response from all over the Eastern Seaboard, then, as when you were secretary of the State Board of Elections, that can affect a lot of folks who have to vote absentee suddenly and without warning. It can affect a larger area than terrorism can. And a lot of people don't plan for it. And you also have a lot of built-in assumptions from folks, from policymakers, that elections just happen, like they're just magic. And people are just going to show up because, it just always happens. And this is the United States, and we're entitled to this. And what we're learning, I think, with the COVID-19 situation is that we're not entitled to it. And so how do we make sure that we're resilient enough to make do? And York County is pretty well situated, I think, with dealing with polling place locations. I think we're going to have a challenge finding enough people. We're going to have to see how that goes. But one of the suggestions I would have, based on what I'm seeing for our May elections that are going on in Virginia, which York County does not have, is some of the places in Virginia have polling places in churches or private facilities. And those are easier, it's easier for those places to say, no, you can't use us. And so I think if you're a local official, one of the things I would do to make your life easier and to help your voters and help smooth out the November election is, if possible, try to get your polling places by November in government-owned buildings so that you have more control over their availability on election day. If they're in private places and they're closed because of gathering restrictions, like no more than 10 people, it's kind of hard to tell them they have to open for an election, but they couldn't open for Easter, or they can't open for Passover, or whatever other religious events might be going on.
Thank you, Walt. Professor Morley, I want to bring you into the discussion. You've had a chance to review the emergency laws across the country. What are some of the deficiencies that you've seen? What are some of the laws and procedures that have worked best, in your opinion, in giving officials, state and local election officials, the needed flexibility to administer their elections?
In thinking about election systems and the degree to which they're able to be modified or adapted in order to respond to emergencies, I think it's helpful to think about three different types of statutes. Most basically, you have just your general election code, and the initial question is, under the ordinary laws that govern the electoral process, how much discretion do election officials have to be able to modify typical procedures, work outside of ordinary procedures to be able to deal with crises? So in response to something like COVID, for example, where we will expect to see a surge in absentee voting, where keeping people away from polling places, from congregating together where an infectious disease could be spread, is one of the most natural responses to that type of disaster. Something as simple as automatically sending out absentee ballot request forms or absentee ballot application forms is a step that in many jurisdictions is something that is well within officials' discretion to do under the ordinary rules that govern the electoral process. It's just that in an ordinary election, particularly since in many jurisdictions throughout the nation, absentee voting typically doesn't play a substantial role. You see as few as less than 10% of ballots in many jurisdictions are cast via absentee voting. That's not the type of step that election officials would ordinarily take where you're not facing a crisis such as COVID. A second major source of authority then is what I refer to as election emergency statutes, which states such as New York have certain types of statutes. Virginia has a fairly detailed election emergency statute. Maryland, Utah, Florida have election emergency statutes. And these laws greatly differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some cases, election officials have authority to postpone an election, to either extend the period for voting or just to change when election day will be, to change when the day for in-person voting will be. Other jurisdictions instead allow election officials to make what I refer to as election modifications, changes to the rules governing the electoral process, but without changing election day, without extending or changing the election period. And in fact, the US Supreme Court's ruling in RNC versus DNC arising from the Wisconsin situation a few weeks ago seems to be largely consistent with that dichotomy, that the Supreme Court suggested that it would be holding court-imposed election postponements or extensions to a higher standard than modifications, to changing the rules of the process within the context of an ongoing election without changing or extending election day. And so those election emergency laws can be extremely valuable tools for election officials to use, to the extent that it gives them the flexibility to modify or suspend particular requirements, particular procedures in order to respond to an election. And then the final source of relevant authority is the general state of emergency statutes that every state in the nation gives governors certain additional powers in the course of declared emergencies. The major question and the major deviation we see among various states with regard to these general state of emergency laws is when the governor declares an emergency, is he or she permitted to suspend all statutory or regulatory provisions or deadlines, as many jurisdictions allow? Is the governor permitted only to suspend administrative regulations, but not statutory provisions or deadlines, which was what the law said in Wisconsin, which then led to the confusion in Wisconsin, where the governor tried to suspend election day, tried to stop in-person voting on election day, and the state Supreme Court said, you don't have that authority. Your state's general state of emergency law does not empower you to suspend statutes during states of emergency. And then there's approximately 7 jurisdictions where the governor has neither type of authority, where even in the context of a declared emergency, the governor cannot or does not have express power anyway to suspend either statutes or regulations. And so in those jurisdictions, the governor has the least flexibility to respond to unexpected crises, unexpected disasters, where you don't have an adequate statutory infrastructure in place, where you don't have election emergency laws, where you don't have that type of broad gubernatorial discretion under general state of emergency statutes. It greatly hinders states' abilities to respond. It puts election officials, to a certain extent governors themselves, in the position of deciding what to do in the face of an emergency when it appears they lack statutory authority to do so. We saw in Wisconsin the consequences of that. And at the end of the day, it puts greater pressure then on courts to step in and to try to adjudicate these matters in emergency proceedings, in rushed proceedings, on an ad hoc basis, just engaging in subjective balancing to try to figure out whether there's a constitutional violation, and if so, how to try to remedy that constitutional violation on the fly in the middle of an ongoing emergency. And that's the last thing that states want to be doing, especially since then it would be shifting the burden back onto election officials to make those court-ordered changes at the last minute, rather than being able to plan more comprehensively, plan more carefully, most importantly, plan in advance to be able to respond adequately to those sorts of crises.
Well, that's very helpful. It can be very confusing at times to determine what it actually is the authority that you have and how it meets the circumstances that you're facing. So Walt and Mark, in your states, what part of the emergency laws or regulations have been helpful to you and your local election officials in actually administering an election? And then sort of tie that into how you're, specifically for COVID-19. Sometimes it doesn't cover all the contingencies, but it does help you. It gives you a launching point, at least, to try to prepare for and mitigate the issues.
I'll let the state level expert go first.
Go ahead, Mark.
So Walt said something earlier about polling locations. So let's look at the Federal CARES Act. I know you're talking more in line of what we have existing law in the state, but the CARES Act is going to allow us to plan some. And I agree with Walt to the extent that's possible. If you can use public buildings, the better off you are. But one of the things that we're going to do here, we are concerned that we're going to lose some of the private places that we utilize. So we're contacting them now and letting them know that we are partnered with you. We do care about your facility, and we're offering deep cleanings after the election. And we're going to do that with some of the funds that the CARES Act has provided. So I can't I can't express enough how much the CARES Act, that's going to help us prepare for this election in August and November. I've already mentioned a little bit about, and I didn't go as much in detail as I probably should have. We have the ability to combine polling locations. Now with COVID-19, it's a little different in that you really don't want to combine, it's a last resort. It's not a first resort, because if you start combining polling locations, or if you start reducing polling locations, now you're confining more people to that location. The reality is you've got to have a plan for that in case that were to happen. And our law allows us to combine, and like I said, we can create a super site or we can create a mega site. A mega site is where anyone can vote. Typically, that's going to be the Election Commission office. So if we start closing polling locations in a wide-scale manner, that's one of the avenues that we have. The other thing that we can do is the super site. The mega site is where anyone can vote. The super site is where you can combine a few polling locations. So if you have 3 or 4 in a different area, you can combine those and have people that go there. That takes a lot of planning on the front end to make sure that the voting equipment is set up to have that, the extra abilities there. But you have to have a contingency to the contingency. So in other words, if I know that I can't use polling location A, I'm going to send these individuals to B. What we saw in the tornado, it was whole areas that we had to close. So our contingency was B, and so then we had to start sending them to C and D. And so our law allows that. That's something that's very important. One of the things that we stole from another state, when we did have the tornadoes, our poll hours got extended in Davidson County. Now, it hit 2 other counties as well, but there were some folks that came in and sued to extend the hours. We had to keep the polling location open until 10 p.m. Central Time. Well, many of the election officials had been affected by the storm themselves. And all day long, they're worried about their home, they're worried about various things, and tired because, they're arriving at 6 a.m. in the morning. We saw that Indiana could split shifts. And so what we did in Tennessee, we asked the legislature, and they agreed to allow polling officials to work part of the day. It seems to have worked in Indiana. One of the concerns we had, what happens if these individuals don't show up, doesn't seem to have been an issue there. So I think that's going to help us. Not just with emergencies when hours get extended, but also in this scenario, when you're recruiting poll officials, we've certainly been told no a number of times because folks said they can't work the entire day. Now we're going to be able to work half the day. So that's something that we're interested, that we're going to use. The other thing that we've used quite a bit as well, our law allows us, or actually mandates, that we have emergency ballots at every polling location. And that may be every state, I don't know, but we certainly have it here. Well, we certainly had instances where we have voted people on emergency ballots, paper ballots. Most of the counties in Tennessee do vote on DREs, so we've utilized that as well. The other thing, it's not really an emergency law, but it's something that has helped us in a number of different elections. We have in-person voting that's pretty generous. It starts 20 days before the election, ends 5 days before the election. You don't have to have an excuse. We open a number of different sites. That alleviates the traffic. We have 2/3 of our voters who typically will take care of the voting process in this in-person process. And for Tennessee, it's a huge deal because 97.5% of our voters typically vote in person. So our entire elections are geared around that. That alleviates that. So if you don't have early voting in person prior to the election, I would strongly advise you to talk to your legislature about that. It's bailed us out a number of times. The fewer people you have on election day, simply it's easier to administer that election, no matter what may come your way. And it certainly helped during the tornadoes and other things as well.
Well, did you want to weigh in on that as well? You might need to unmute your button.
Yeah, I just unmuted. Virginia's laws are very detailed, but they are also very limited what can happen during emergencies. So, for example, during this particular disaster, virus, however you want to look at it, some of the emergency procedures for absentee voting didn't really apply because of some of the prefatory language in that code section. So the emergency section we were able to use in Virginia, or that the governor ended up using, was moving the election by 2 weeks. He can move any election with a state of emergency by 2 weeks. And then a locality, if it thinks it needs additional time, can move the election can go to the Supreme Court of Virginia, and a 3-judge panel will hear it and move the election, or can move the election another 14 days, or no more than 30 days from the date of the original election. Obviously, that has some issues with this type of disaster, which I don't think anyone really anticipated a pandemic. And so moving, say, the May election 30 days puts you still within the window of the stay-at-home order here in Virginia that we would have, and it also is within a week or so of the June primary, which everyone has. So that really wouldn't have helped a lot of people. The governor ended up moving, as y'all may know, moving the May election by 2 weeks and moved the June primary by 2 weeks. And so that's been very helpful to us. That's not an option with state, I believe, like governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, statewide offices. So, as far as for the COVID-19 pandemic, I know we have to be careful because people need to know that the election is going to happen, but you also have to have flexibility with an election. What happens if Florida or Virginia get wiped out by a hurricane in November? We're still in hurricane season. So I don't know what the solution is there. You can't necessarily move the election before you start running into issues with the Electoral College. So as far as us, we depend on the state for what their emergency powers are, because we really don't have a lot here.
Mark, just to follow up on that, how much interaction does your office and the Secretary of State need with the governor? In some states, the chief election official has some authority to move things. In other states, it sort of relies on the governor. And I haven't moved a question for you yet, but could you talk about that, Mark, quickly before we move on to the next question about whether or not you need the governor to declare an emergency, or what authorities rest with the secretary versus the governor?
Yeah, thus far, to move an election, it's taken a court order. So we have taken the route. Now, the governor does have authority to suspend some laws in Tennessee, but then you have some constitutional issues dealing with the election. Looking at the Tennessee Constitution, of course, in November, you'd have to look at some of the federal statutes as well as Electoral College, as Walt mentioned as well. But as far as communication, the way that communication is working here, the Attorney General's office is involved with the governor's office. We have had we've had numerous conversations with the Attorney General. We've also talked to the counsel for the governor, and we've had some conference calls with the governor. Mainly more than anything else is, what the planning is and potentially looking forward. But as far as August and those things, we haven't really gone into a lot of conversation about whether the governor can postpone the election and those things, because we're August and November. We've got the presidential primary behind us. We do have some time. So the main focus that we have in Tennessee is to looking at the existing laws and developing our plan around the confines of what we already have in place. And fortunately, I have something maybe some other states don't have, and some other counties don't. Obviously, other counties don't have is, our PPP, our presidential primary, is behind us, and so we're looking forward to August.
Right. So, Professor Morley, let's talk a little bit about what happens. In reviewing some of the states, it appeared just reviewing the statutes, often the state has no statutory authority to modify the rules of an election. What happens when that occurs, or when that's the state of the law? And if a legislature was looking at sort of providing emergency powers to the governor or the chief election official, what can they look to in crafting those election laws?
So again, one possible outcome would be if you have election officials or state officials that take action in response to an emergency that winds up not being statutorily authorized, for which they don't actually have authorization, as we saw with what happened recently in Wisconsin. The courts could simply reject that. One of the worst case scenarios, of course, would be where the court rejects that after the fact, where people have voted in reliance on what election officials have told them. And then as a result, those ballots wind up being held invalid. We've seen this in a recent election cycle down in Florida, where a county supervisor of elections purported to authorize internet voting in response to a hurricane, where that particular county was hit very hard by a hurricane. He allowed people to email in ballots. State law simply doesn't permit that, and those were unfortunately wound up being illegal votes. In New Jersey, there was a county election official who unilaterally encouraged voters to start faxing back ballots. And not only, again, was that not an authorized means of transmission, but the system itself didn't even have the infrastructure to handle it, that the fax machine ran out of toner, ran out of paper. There were hundreds of voters who were trying to send the ballots back, who they were getting error messages, the ballots weren't going through. In response to one of the emergency orders that the lieutenant governor had issued, voters were permitted to vote in alternate polling locations. They weren't cautioned that those alternate locations would not have all of the local offices that would be on the ballot and all of the local propositions that would have been on the ballot had they voted in their original polling location. And so as a result, there was approximately 100 voters who were deprived of the opportunity to vote on a local rent control initiative. And a court wound up throwing out the initiative, saying that because the final margin was less than 100 votes, those votes could have been dispositive. And so they wound up having to rerun the election. So certainly, whether it's in preparing a contingency plan or trying to take action on the spot in the midst of an emergency, ensuring that there's adequate statutory authority in place can both reduce confusion, can avoid that on-off switch of having the governor announce something and a court enjoin it a few hours later that we saw, or after the election, calling into question the validity of the outcome and potentially having votes not counted or otherwise held invalid by a court. If the other consequence of not having that statutory infrastructure in place, of course, is then it will often lead to litigation where, whether it's candidates, political parties, voters, voting rights groups, will often then go to courts seeking emergency relief. And by that point, then it's now out of the hands of the legislature, out of the hands of election officials. And it's up to an individual judge who might not have much of a background in the electoral process, who might not be familiar or sensitive to all of the competing considerations with which the Secretary of State's offices, county clerk's offices, election officers are familiar. And again, that judge is in the position of, on the fly, based largely on often partisanly tinged submissions, trying to figure out what types of modifications to make, how to change the electoral process in response to this ongoing emergency. And so that just underscores the need to have these issues worked out in advance, to have an adequate statutory framework in advance in order to be able to deal with these issues. You had asked about how states can go about trying to adopt these statutes or get ideas for these statutes. It's an issue that certainly I've written about. I have an Emory Law Journal article talking about election emergency statutes, principles for crafting them. I know there are national associations of election officials, or National Secretaries of State Association, that obviously over the course of the past year, they've been giving a tremendous amount of attention to dealing with and responding to election emergencies. And this is something that over the upcoming weeks, over the upcoming months, I know that there are several groups, there are several task forces, I'm involved with some of them, that are trying to pull together model legislation, additional guidance, make as much help available to legislatures as they can, drawing on the successes that we've seen in other states and drawing upon successful examples in other states, ensuring that we're able to withstand not just COVID, but as many of the other speakers have said, right, unfortunately, there's no rule that says you can only have one emergency at a time. You can have COVID while a hurricane is hitting. You can have COVID while there's a widespread power outage, some sort of cyber attack, right? You could have two or more emergencies. And so it's extremely important when you're crafting these election emergency laws to make your system as robust as possible, able to withstand as wide a range of possible disasters as you can. And the way to do that is by authorizing multiple different channels of voting. The more different channels of voting you have, in-person voting, absentee voting, curbside voting. Many states allow bipartisan teams of election officials to go to assisted living facilities or hospitals for voters who aren't able to travel to the polling place in order to give them the opportunity to cast ballots. The more different channels of voting that you have available, the greater you reduce the systemic risk that any particular emergency or a mix of emergencies will just completely disable your system.
Walt or Mark, do you want to comment on that at all?
No, I think he explained it very well. I've read parts of the Emory Law article that he's mentioned. It does a great job of going into the different scenarios.
Oh, good. The next question I have is sort of for all of you is, based on your review or your experiences, what best practices could states take to ensure that their electoral systems are able to withstand the broadest possible range of election emergencies? And I know each of you have talked about specifics, but if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the best practices that you've witnessed at the local level, that would be helpful.
I'll defer to Walt. I've been going first before, so Walt, go ahead.
Let's see, which question was this? All panelists. I froze a little bit there. I would say that I think that this is kind of like very broad, like just we'll fix it. But I think that elections are generally, at least in Virginia, they have not been part of emergency planning. Now, some localities will tell you they have an emergency plan and that they're involved in it, but we've been trying to get involved or be a part of the emergency planning in Virginia so that when localities or regions or the state are trying to deal with, say a hurricane or something like that, what if it happens while we're having an election? What is the plan? What happens if people can't get out of their houses because the roads are blocked? That's great that people are working on the electricity, but how do we do an election? What happens if the process is just jammed up? And again, I think it comes back to this. There's been a lot of energy and time spent on dealing with terrorism, which is legitimate. I get that. But I think a far bigger threat to an election, as far as a showstopper event, is dealing with a hurricane or something, because we generally, even in the best of times, election offices are not the most resourced offices. And we depend a lot on essentially what you would call volunteers. They may get a little bit of pay, but it's very small. They're not going to ford rivers and 6-foot snows or anything like that to get to the polling places necessarily. So how do you make sure that you are resilient enough to handle that? Well, you've got to at least recognize the problems, and you've got to be a part of the plan for dealing with them. And I think that that's something that, like Professor Morley was saying, I think that states need to do a better job of looking at of what are the emergencies that could threaten an election. We can now add pandemic to what is a possible thing. Until 2011, Virginia didn't anticipate earthquakes either, but now we talk about having earthquakes on primary day, and so we learned from that. So it could be a growing list. We could try to have a big meeting and have everyone brainstorm about issues, but how do you get them on the list, and then how do you deal with those problems? And then I think too, I'm kind of a big fan. In law school, I was very impressed with the Uniform Law Commission and the whole idea behind that. And I think that I think having the states individually come up with something to deal with emergencies would be great. But I think also having something that would be like a uniform law that states could look at and model their legislation on would not only help those states, but also provide some kind of a standard or floor of what a state could or should be looking at, as well as also standardize across the country. This is what to expect if a Senate election could not be held. This is what to expect if a gubernatorial election could not be held. And so it's not like, well, now we need to get an expert on law in Wyoming to find out what Wyoming is going to do. I think more of that planning is important, and I think it hasn't been done because, again, we go back to elections are just assumed that they're just going to happen. And so no one has planned for these things, and the consequence is normally election officials and the election officers who work on election day have bent over backwards to make elections happen. And I think with COVID-19, what we're seeing is we might have actually met our match because there's only but so much you can do. If everyone's in quarantine, you can't meet but so many people at one time, and people are afraid they're going to catch something. I mean, it may be just the limit that makes it impossible to cope with, barring some massive infusion of help and assistance.
So Mark, I'm just going to follow up on that question. I'm not going to move on to the next one yet. So one of the things that I've sort of felt is that communication, those relationships can be built prior to an election, but once the emergency hits, the frustration that I sort of had was, how do I make elections a priority amongst all the other needs? And I think that I think presidential elections are obviously going to go to the top of the list because everyone's focused on it. But how would you, having dealt with your EMA or emergency folks, how do you raise the importance of elections to the top of the list when trying to deal in response to an emergency?
Well, I think Walt mentioned it a little bit earlier. Someone, maybe it was you, Commissioner Palmer. You know, a lot of people think elections happen overnight. You know, we're wedding planners or whatever you may be, and basically not much that goes into it. A key to it is letting individuals know there's intense training and preparation that goes into an election. All the moving parts, from the different vendors that you have to deal with to different locations. I mean, it is really a huge production to recruit 17,000 individuals to come in. You know, Tennessee, how many poll officials we have to come in and make sure that their elections are fair and accurate, you know, to train these individuals. And, you know, to have the contingencies to go along with those individuals. So large part of it is about education to the legislature to let them know that we are a priority. The same thing with the emergency management agencies, you know, and to do it early on. I'll tell you one of the things that, as far as building relationships, it's not just with the EMA, but it kind of goes hand in hand. One of the things we've done with COVID-19 here, and I have found it extremely helpful, we have 5 different machine vendors in Tennessee, and that may be unique. I know many states have only one vendor, but we have divided, we offered up a working group. Any administrator that wanted to participate in a working group for their vendor, we had a team leader at the state, 2 team leaders actually, and we would organize conference calls and we would get best practices. And from that, we have developed planning based per vendor, and the vendor was there as well. So we needed what was realistic. If we needed, you know, the equipment infrastructure now, can we get it shipped here? Can we make these things work? You know, they were there to say, yes, we can provide this equipment. No, we can't. Yes, that'll work. Yes, this will not. But from that collaboration, I think we've gotten closer in Tennessee. And so now we've taken, you know, this working group of 41 administrators on 95 counties globally, and we're having these calls on a regular basis. We're doing the same thing as state election directors having regular calls. So while we're doing that, you hear how folks have built these relationships up, particularly with the local EMAs. But we have stressed to our counties numerous times during our training, these are your friends, and without them, you may not be successful. So certainly when we had the first tornado since I've been here that did a major impact. They had some tornadoes before me, but since 2009, the first tornado that really affected Grundy County, 10 polling locations, all 10 needed generators. Well, we had generators for most of the polling locations as our contingency plan. We didn't have a contingency plan for all 10. So we're dealing with the EMA and making sure that we can get generators there, all polling locations opened on time with that collaboration. But more importantly, they're there also to bring necessary supplies throughout the day. And the communication, when you have something like a tornado or something like that hits, I could not communicate with the administrator through his cell phone. He had lost coverage. He could not communicate necessarily with the folks that run the polls. We have one officer there in charge. Necessarily, he couldn't do that at all 10. So he literally was using the EMAs to do so. They're using, police officers to communicate word back and forth, particularly in the beginning times, they are your friends. And we are heavily using them in Tennessee to help acquire some of the PPP or PPE. You know, they're going to help us. They're assisting us with masks and gloves. Once again, Tennessee's a little different situation from some states because we don't have an election until August. But we do have to have these things in place for July. So I can't stress enough. And, you know, on my index card that I put in my pocket that I was telling you about, you know, one of the first three numbers that's on there, I think it's number 3. I think the AG number 1, but number 3 is the EMA director for the state. And when the tornado was hitting, we definitely had a lot of communication early on. They helped us. They alerted us to some counties we didn't know a tornado had hit. The administrator didn't know a tornado had hit. And that's the other thing. Now, this is a little different because it's more globally. You know, we know that COVID-19 is going to affect the entire state. But when you have it hit, even though it's 50 miles long, it's really 2 different elections. You've got most part of the state, they have no idea what's going on. And so you're getting the phone calls, normal phone calls that you get, you know, where's my polling location, all those things. At the same time, you're getting phone calls, oh my goodness, my polling location's destroyed, my home's destroyed, what do I do? And even in Davidson County, it was a tale of 2 different elections. 40% of our polling locations weren't able to open up on time because of tornadoes, 60% were. Those 60% that were able to open up, it was a huge disconnect. Those phone calls we were getting from those polling locations were a lot different from the phone calls that we were getting from the other locations. So, you know, you got to take that into consideration that, you know, the calls that you're getting, the normal calls you're going to get, what we did triage. I handled all the emergency questions. We had folks here that handled the other questions, which typically we're all hands on deck. There's 8 individuals that work here. Another thing that I would encourage you to do when you're working with your EMA, don't be the only source of contact. Have multiple people, because the tornado did get very close to my home. And the thought did come to my mind, who replaces me? Because here we have folks that are still sitting into they're experts in the field. You know, I've got an ADA person, they're an expert in that. But not, you know, we may cross-train one other person. There's not a lot of cross-training with all the different pockets, all the different moving parts. Fortunately, I have a great relationship with the Secretary of State here, Trey Hargett. He would be an instant role because I do keep him informed on everything that we do here. But on the local level, you know, if you get quarantined, if you're the director of elections there, administrative elections on the local level, who knows everything about that office? You've got to have that person. The same thing with the officer at the local location. We've not really trained much on what happens if the officer doesn't show up because they're so dependable. We rarely, you know, that's the cream of our crop. Here, you've got to have a backup. Now, I stole this from another state as well, maybe in Wisconsin, but I'm not sure which state it was. But I saw in their planning, they created a PowerPoint. Now, we typically, if you have a video, that's something easily you can show. But, you know, if you have poll officials that cancel on the last moment, and we may have this, you know, I do think we're going to have a poll official shortage. Have some of those, you know, and we require training in Tennessee in most instances, you know, have a PowerPoint, if nothing else, if you have to recruit at the very last moment, you know, just where you can briefly go over that training. You know, but a lot of it is about communication. And if you're getting to know your EMA officials either on the state level, on the local level, on election day or right before election day, you need to know now. And you know, the other thing is they can help give you some of their contingency plans. The right hand does need to know what the left hand is doing. And I feel like with us, particularly on the state level, we have a great relationship with the EMA office here. It's called TEMA, and we communicate before an election and obviously on election day we're communicating.
So we're nearing the end of this Zoom interview. I'd like to, you know, we've seen a lot of these emergency laws come into effect, you know, with the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you each just give your final thoughts on how these emergency laws have worked and how you see it playing out the rest of this 2020 election cycle?
Sure, I can jump in there and start. So I think that one of the main surprises that we've seen here is just how much the extent to which existing election emergency laws really were focused more on natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, things where delaying by a few days, delaying by a week or two could materially change and could materially help and adequately address. One of the most common types of emergency-related provisions we see that's been alluded to is the ability to move polling locations. That just about every state in the nation says that if a polling location becomes physically inaccessible on election day or immediately before election day, election officials can move it at the last minute, even if the ordinary deadline for determining where the polling locations will be has passed. Most of the types of remedies that have been built into election emergency statutes really aren't responsive to something like a pandemic, where just delaying by a few days or delaying by a week or moving things around, or another common remedy we see, which we've talked about, going to paper ballots, right? There, again, one of the most common provisions that we see is if there's a power failure at a polling location, or if the voting machines stop working at a polling location, you can use emergency backup paper ballots. These are types of remedies that are, again, great responses to certain types of emergencies, but don't really move the needle much when it comes to something like a pandemic. So again, rethinking our election emergency statutory infrastructure to be able to respond to the full range of possible emergencies, which we now know includes global pandemic, is, I think, one of the upshots of our experience here. And certainly going forward prospectively, we'll be able to make our election emergency laws more robust to be able to deal with this. But I want to emphasize, one of the most important measures that election officials can take isn't even necessarily an emergency type measure. It doesn't even necessarily require special statutory authorization. It's being prepared if you're in a jurisdiction where typically less than 10% of votes are cast via absentee ballot, being prepared to have 40, 50, 60% of votes being cast via absentee ballot. This means not only, most importantly, actually having the absentee ballots available to be able to mail out, but also making sure you have the personnel you need to process those requests, to deal with the absentee ballots when they come back, confirm their validity, get them prepared for the machines, even having the scanning machines or counting and tallying machines in place that you need to deal with an order of magnitude greater number of ballots than you ordinarily have. Even so, that's not a matter of rethinking the structure of the electoral system, but rather expanding the electoral system, ensuring that you have the resources and personnel that you need in order to be able to implement the same type of election that you usually do under circumstances where half or more of the electorate are going to be voting absentee, when typically that winds up being just a trickle. The one other thing that we haven't touched on that I just wanted to quickly mention before we leave, which is, one of the most election officials have several major key jobs, right? One of them is ensuring that all legally eligible voters have a chance to cast a ballot safely without endangering their lives, to have that ballot be counted. On the other hand, they have a systemic responsibility to the system to ensure that you get a legally valid and accurate outcome, and that the system has the appearance of propriety, right? It's not just enough to get it right, but to conduct the election in a way that instills public confidence, that the general public has assurance that everything has been conducted properly on the up and up. And one of the major things that election officials can do, in my view, to further that goal, we're going to be in an election where, by all estimations, due to COVID, we're going to see historically high numbers of absentee ballots being cast. It's entirely possible that, particularly for jurisdictions that aren't used to dealing with them, that they're not going to be able to get through a significant portion of those ballots by election night. That we're going to see news broadcasters reporting 100% of precincts reporting, here are the results, but it may very well be there's a stack of 50,000 or 100,000 absentee ballots or provisional ballots that haven't been counted yet. So one of the things that is incumbent on the one hand on news media to emphasize, but also of election officials to be proactive in affirmatively pushing out at every opportunity, is not just what are the tallies, not just how many precincts have we counted, what are the current vote totals, but just as importantly, here's the number of ballots, or at least estimated number of ballots yet to be counted. Because one of the nightmare scenarios of the election is you have one candidate that appears to be the winner as of election night with 100% of precincts reporting. And yet when all of the rest of the absentee ballots, all of the provisional ballots get counted, then a different candidate is announced to be the winner. That will lead to public turmoil, that will lead to accusations going back and forth in terms of the legitimacy of the election. The more the public is aware up front that 100% of precincts reporting doesn't mean the election's over, doesn't mean illegal ballots are being snuck in there, but that they know up front we still have tens of thousands of ballots left to count, the greater the chances of minimizing uncertainty or doubt or questioning any differentials that you see between election night results and final results.
Walt, any last comments, Walt? I don't see Walt. Mark, do you have any last comments on sort of?
Yeah, I agree with him. I mean, it is, particularly for Tennessee, 97.5% typically vote in person. So 2.5% been sending their ballots in by mail. It is, and I think what I hear Walt saying, I don't want to put, I mean, not Walt, but Dr. Morley saying, I think you need to be flexible enough to have a combination of in person and by mail. And that's what we have in Tennessee, and we plan on having in August, November, because one of the things you look at, what happens if the postal service area is quarantined and they can't deliver the mail? Or what one of their fears is, because we're not used to processing that many absentee ballots, our laws are geared toward in person. I know a lot of states that do process that many absentee ballots can start getting the ballots ready to go through the scanner. We cannot. The earliest we can start is the beginning of the morning when the polls open. Well, we may have the scanning capability, but it's another component to have something to scan. The ballots may be there, but we get those coffee table ballots, that aren't going to go through the scanner appropriately. You've got to do the verification. So that's clearly something that we are concerned with. The other thing is, as far as counting boards, you got to have enough space. So it's not a perfect solution either way you go. We are voting in a pandemic, and I think what the professor said there is strong, in that you have to prepare the public that results may be later. It's not going to be normal, and unfortunately, we are doing our best. We are doing our planning, and we are going to do we're on the smoothest election that we can. But it is a huge challenge to do so. The other thing we haven't touched on, but outside groups can sue, and that's one of the things, in the tornado, when they extended the hours to 10 p.m., it really hurt the morale of those folks that had been affected as far as polling officials. So you don't, you can lose polling officials that way. But let me give you an example where sometimes lawsuits can stymie growth. And I think this is something that election officials may need to take into consideration. We think that our counties, if they can, need to expand early voting hours and early voting locations if they are able to. We had a county that did that one time for the November election, presidential election, more people vote, made sense. August election doesn't always make sense. The law says in Tennessee you have to have, a minimum number. So they were meeting the minimum number, but once they expanded, all of a sudden that became the expectation. And when they went down to what they normally would do for an August election, where the turnout is a lot lower, they got sued, and the court came in and said, you have to open up all these polling locations. Well, in this situation, we're telling our counties, make it very clear. We are expanding the hours, and we're getting different polling locations because of COVID-19. Frankly, in other elections, we may not need that many satellite locations. This is a situation where we are trying to spread folks out. So the lawsuit component, unfortunately, does come into play. And as far as watching, all three of us were attorneys, as far as watching what's going on in other states, there's always litigation in an election cycle. I don't recall seeing this much litigation this early in my tenure as either a state election commissioner or a coordinator of elections for the state. And unfortunately, that creates a problem for us outside of even working within the confines of Tennessee law. And that may be another issue for us to try to help educate some later on in the judiciary, where we can do some CLEs or something along those lines to let them know some of the ramifications and the reason we do things. You know, the other thing is, you hear the statement, particularly when they're legislating various things, don't let the crisis, be the reason for the crisis. Never let a good crisis go to waste. There will be some times in Tennessee where we may have to close some polling locations, either because the location won't let us come in there, we can't properly social distance, or we can't recruit enough poll officials. But we're definitely telling our local administrators, don't let the crisis become the reason. If you've had a polling location you've wanted closed in the past for a different reason, and you can open it, then go ahead and open it. Because that's how you can get the legislature to come back in and restrict you more. Right now we have some great flexibility. If that is abused in the wrong way, then you can have some issues. And the other thing is, just make sure politics don't come into play. If you're going to close certain locations, don't be doing it because you have a political leaning one way or another. Fortunately, what I've found in working with Republicans and Democrat election officials, that's normally not what I see. Normally, this is what I see. I see local election officials making decisions, at least in Tennessee, based on what's best for the voters. And that's what I would encourage other folks as well. If you're making decisions, look at the interest of the voters and also your polling workers as well.
Thank you, Mark. I want to thank both of you for your time. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you again for being a part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you for arranging this.
You're welcome.